Well, welcome everybody. I see the attendance numbers slowly crawling up. I would like to personally welcome you all to the OpenSSF Tech Talk on June 12th, 2025. We have an amazing lineup of experts here to kind of share their wisdom and experiences that they have learned about our favorite global cybersecurity topic, the Cyber Resilience Act. We're going to talk to you today about how to prepare your open source project for these new EU cybersecurity regulations. Next slide, please. Again, we really appreciate everybody here kind of spending your time today. This video is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch us now, and then also additionally in the future, this will be posted to our OpenSSF YouTube channel. We're going to leverage all the amazing features of Zoom today. I think it's the next slide. Ah, it'll be a slide in the future, but there is a feature within the Zoom tool for Q&A. So if you'll notice, there's a little, as Angela has highlighted there in a little red box. So if you have questions, please type those in. And if you would like to potentially direct it, if you have a question for Dave Rousseau or Adrian or Dave Wheeler, if you could kind of preface this as a question for these speakers to kind of help us get it routed, that would be great. So let's pop back a couple slides. Uh, as with all our agenda today is we're going to talk about some awesome housekeeping stuff. I'm going to do some introductions. We're going to talk about how to understand the CRA. We're going to talk about some amazing research our partners over in the LF research team did for us, the Unaware and Uncertain report. We're going to get a perspective from an organization on how they are preparing for their CRA obligations. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our CRA 101 class and other things that help you all prepare for this amazing legislation that's going to come into effect. There's some pieces that come into effect next year in 2026, and then the bill finally goes into effect December of 2027. We'll have some questions and answers, some discussion, and then my friend Angela has some really important announcements at the end, so stay tuned. Don't leave early. As with all Linux Foundation events, we are governed by two artifacts that help us neutrally collaborate together. First off is our antitrust policy. So please take a moment to refamiliarize yourself with this. And we're also covered by the Linux Foundation and OpenSSF's Code of Conduct, where we agree that we treat each other professionally with respect. We're here to have, a positive educational time today together. So if you haven't, check out both those amazing pieces of guidance. They help us go forward. Small disclaimer. This webinar is providing you some general information. This should not be considered legal advice. If you are in a position where you have legal questions, please reach out to your lawyer because that's important because there are some nuances and some distinctions that you need to be aware of. Let's go on and do some introductions. My name's Krob. I'm your host today. I'm the least interesting person on this phone call. I'm the chief security architect here at the OpenSSF. I do stuff. I do mostly security. Next speaker, please. I'd like Adrian to introduce herself.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm Adrienne Lawson, and I lead our survey-based research at the Linux Foundation research team. We're looking at different vertical industries and um, different regions to try and understand open source trends, be it kind of cybersecurity, be it AI. And so in this one, we were investigating CRA specifically. And I'll talk more about this in the findings session.
Thank you. That's a great report. And after she's done talking, I hope you all run out and read it. Next up, can my friend Dave Rousseau give a little introduction?
Hi, Dave Russo. I work at Red Hat. I'm the Product Security Governance Portfolio Manager. Our team is part of the Product Security organization that's focused on understanding different regulatory requirements, compliance frameworks, and such that affect the software that Red Hat provides and what we need to do to ensure that our secure development and delivery practices are in line to not only mitigate risk, but meet all of these external requirements.
Excellent. And Dave's going to share some really interesting perspectives from his organization on their CRA journey. And last but not least, the second member of the Council of Daves, Dr. Wheeler, could you give a brief introduction?
Absolutely. So David A. Wheeler, I work at the Linux Foundation, and I've been working on open source software and developing secure software for literally decades. I'll be sharing soon various information about the CRA and what it all means. So looking forward to that.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Next slide, please. All right. David gets to kick us off talking about understanding the CRA. Take it away, sir.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here's my outline. Just anywhere from what the CRA is and why it matters, all the way to what's changing next. So first of all, what is the subject of what we're talking about today? We're talking about the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA. It is a European Union regulation. That's a kind of law. The formal term is that it has entered into force in 2024. So this is not some law that might in the future be signed into law. It has already been, oh, no, go back. It has already been signed into law. Now, there's some time given for people to comply with this new law, but that time is already mostly gone. Some reporting is going to be required in 2026, and the full requirements will go into effect in 2027. And for a lot of organizations, that means they don't have much time left. It applies to products with digital elements, PDEs, that are made available on the EU market, and the goal is to secure these PDEs. Now, the reason we're talking about it is this is the first broad law that applies to lots of software globally. This is not guidance. This is a requirement, a legal requirement, and it applies even if the developers are not located in the EU. The only thing that matters is, can somebody in the EU, is it basically released to those in the EU? And the penalties are pretty steep. You can have penalties up to 15 million euros or 2.5 worldwide annual turnover, whichever is greater. Next. So when does the CRA apply to the open source software? And that turns out to be a little more complicated. It often doesn't apply to open source software. At the very least, you don't need to worry directly about the CRA if you're only doing things like contributing to other open source software projects, publishing code in your own repo without trying to monetize it, or providing web services that aren't part of remote data processing. But as soon as you do certain other activities, you suddenly become what the CRA calls a manufacturer. Basically, this involves things like charging a fee, charging for technical support services beyond their costs, providing a software platform that's getting monetized, requiring personal data in general. And these kinds of activities suddenly make you a manufacturer subject to a lot of additional requirements. And the CRA doesn't care whether or not you're open source. If you do these activities, you are a manufacturer. There are some orgs who aren't a manufacturer, but who routinely support open source software. They become an open source software steward. And then there's a couple of requirements. Next. So there are key obligations for these cases. If you're a manufacturer who develops or manufactures PDEs, that includes software, then you've got to do a number of things: risk management, vulnerability reporting, and so on. And all manufacturers are going to have requirements that affect their relationship with open source software. So, for example, they've got to exercise due diligence. If a vulnerability is found, they've got to report that. Next. Indeed, there's a long list of requirements from the CRA that if you are what the CRA calls a manufacturer. This is a shortened list, and frankly, it's a summary. I'm not going to go through these, but my point is, it's not just do one little thing and done. It's not like that at all. Next. Let me close out this part by debunking some common misconceptions. There's a misconception that the CRA directly applies to all open source software, or that it never applies to open source software. Neither are true. It applies in some cases and not in others. I do think there's a myth that it won't impact open source software, because it's going to widely impact the users and organizations that bring in open source software, and things like requiring reporting and due diligence. There's going to be an indirect impact on lots of folks. Another myth is that the CRA requires the software to be perfect. That's absolutely not true. There's no assumption that software can be made perfect, which is a good thing. What it requires is some effort to do security by design and have a process in place to handle reporting and addressing vulnerabilities when they're found. Next. And what's changing, what's evolving. The CRA imposes a number of high-level requirements on manufacturers. These are intentionally high-level. They're quite vague. If you're used to regulations in other jurisdictions, this is not at all like that. These are very high-level, very vague, intentionally so. The EU is in process of developing standards to provide more detail, but these are optionals. They can provide more legal certainty, but the whole point is that they're optional. In some cases, standards can provide a presumption of conformity. Not all will. So I think that's my last slide for the moment. Next. So thanks. I hope that gives you at least some context of what we're talking about.
And next up, we're going to learn all about the LF research team's unaware and uncertain report. Please take it away, Adrian.
Yes. So first about this survey, we conducted this with LF Research with the support from OpenSSF. And thank you so much, K-Rob and David Wheeler, for your expertise on survey development. It was super helpful. And we ran this study in January 2025. So it is a recent study, but we do have to, hopefully things have been kind of improving since then. A total of 685 respondents completed the awareness section, which was the first part of the survey, which did have follow-ups for those who are even, a little bit slightly aware on specific knowledge gaps. And then we went into different sections for the different kind of key stakeholders or personas that the CRA is trying to kind of define. One was manufacturers, which we got a sample size of 180. For stewards, it was low because it's a very niche group, right? It's either open source organizations or kind of dedicated maintainer organizations, which are formal. And a third category that we wanted to get perspectives on is kind of non-commercial open source contributions. And here it's going to be important that it's more about the activity itself rather than the individual, as we know that one person can wear many hats and can be working for a manufacturer, but also do non-commercial open source work. Next, please. And the link to the study will be shown to you at the end. So the CRA overall awareness level is very, very low. 62% of the 685 people we asked said they are not familiar at all with the CRA, or that they are slightly familiar. So I think it's always good to have survey-based research so that we get out of our bubble and see that even if, for example, we as an expert group think that we know all about the CRA, or trying to get to it, there are a lot of people who don't know. Next, please. And there are specific knowledge gaps. We also ask on the different aspects of the CRA and whether they are aware of it or not. First thing was 32% of the respondents said that they haven't determined whether the CRA applies to them at all. 51% were uncertain about the compliance deadlines. And this really shows that people are just not aware of the different deadlines, compliance regulations that they'll need to deal with. Only 28% of them correctly identified 2027 as the target year for full compliance. 59% were even unaware of the penalties of the CRA if they are not complying, and 56% do not understand the distinction between manufacturers and stewards, which of course I had to dig a little bit into the CRA, and for me it was also a challenge to figure out what the differences are. So it does make sense that it's a legislation that's quite complex and difficult to understand. Next one. So in terms of the manufacturer section in the survey, since we are mainly concerned about open source, we were looking at the kind of relationship that manufacturers have with their open source dependencies. And so here we try to assess whether they are producing SBOMs for all of their products, for example, whether they are aware of the kind of supply chain that's underlying their products. And only 34% of the respondents said that their organization is producing SBOMs for all of their products. 38% said that they're doing security assessment for open source components. Nearly half of them said that they are passively relying on upstream projects for security fixes, which is going to be an issue here with this whole open source ecosystem. And going into the future, 63% of manufacturers do not yet plan to contribute security fixes once the CRA goes into effect. And then if we go to the next slide, we can talk about this a bit more. So I think here with the surveys, right, we're only able to get the high level trends and be able to like talk in very like high level in terms of a higher complexity. And so here, what I think was coming out from the survey is really what people were afraid of when it comes to CRA and open source, which is that manufacturers will be pressuring, expecting open source projects to do all of these compliance and make sure that the vulnerabilities are addressed. Whereas, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, David, and Dave, but I think that the CRA was explicitly trying to say that um, that manufacturers will bear the burden, and open source project maintainers shouldn't be the ones who are fully responsible for this. And so here it was kind of concerning that a lot of people or organizations said that they are not sure whether they will contribute. 19% already said they know, and only 16% of them said that they are already contributing. Next, please. And we also had a section on kind of non-commercial open source activities. And here I put this slide in because here I think I was most interested in whether we will see this undesired effect, which I know that wasn't the intended it wasn't the intention of CRA policymakers to kind of decrease open source contributions, but we were afraid that maybe open source developers will see this regulation and will think that, okay, I should maybe stop and reduce my contributions because I'm not sure whether I'm reliable here. But the data was showing a bit more nuanced way, thankfully, and only 5% of them said that they are thinking about reducing or stopping contributions. A lot of them are uncertain, 16%, 25% are concerned but will continue contributing, and 55% will continue contributing as usual. So for any more findings, please consult the CRA report that we will link later. And yes, I'll give now the word to Dave or Caleb.
Excellent. Thank you. And remind you for everybody, please use the Q&A feature for your questions so I can get those routed to the speakers appropriately. We can address them at the end. I'll try to get the things in the chat at the tail end of things. And now I'll let Dave Rousseau talk about his organization, how they are responding to the CRA.
Thanks, Krob. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, disclaimer, this presentation is not legal advice. The intent here is to share some of the considerations that we at Red Hat have taken in our approach to the CRA and how it's going to impact our organization and the open source community in general. Next slide, please. So asking the question of how the CRA affects Red Hat is important because I think we are a little bit of a unique case in certain areas because of our open source background. This blurb gives a lot of really good information, but there's a couple pieces of this I wanted to highlight. Red Hat is a provider of enterprise open source software solutions. We have a global sales reach, and we are very much embedded with the open source community. We adhere to open source principles, and we want to make sure that those continue to be fostered moving forward. Next slide, please. So breaking down some of that into two roles primarily that Red Hat is looking at from a CRA perspective. We are a manufacturer for the solutions that we provide within the EU marketplace. We are responsible to meet the manufacturer obligations. When we talk more about open source stewardship, we have a relationship with a large number of open source projects across a very wide reach. There are other folks, there are many folks who are contributing to these projects, both inside Red Hat and outside of Red Hat. And there's also other organizations that are involved with many of these projects. So we want to ensure that we understand exactly what the stewardship role means. We're fulfilling that role for certain specific projects for things that we do not manufacture. But most importantly, we're working with other provincial stewards, such as organizations like the Linux Foundation, Eclipse, etc., and that the open source ecosystem is being supported. So just a little bit of context as to how we're approaching things at Red Hat from looking at it from both of those roles. Next slide, please. So when we built the program at Red Hat, we had a lot of things to take into account. So a lot of the information that David covered was very, very high level. There's a lot of details, a lot of obligations, a lot of expectations that are coming out of the law itself. So we had to put together a program that reached across the entire organization and pulled the subject matter experts out of different organizations and groups to ensure that we're addressing each piece of the CRA and the way that it impacts Red Hat. If you're a good way to communicate this to you would be go through briefly the different work streams we have on this program, and that's what this slide shows. We have 8 different work streams we've built in to this program and what the individual outcomes and responsibilities are for each. Next slide. So there are many things that the CRA says need to be done. They are obligations for manufacturers and or stewards. There are other roles the CRA defines with obligations in there. If you think you might fall into one of those roles, I would suggest you familiarize yourself with exactly what they mean. But the two most important ones that we're concerned with are manufacturer and steward. So we want to look at the contents of the law, the requirements that they're stating, the information that's going to be coming out of these horizontal and vertical standards, as well as the additional information that's going to be provided moving forward, and ensure that we've got that covered under Red Hat's governance, that our policy standards, requirements, guidance, practices are all prepared to meet those obligations and the additional reporting pieces that are certain. Understand exactly what stewardship means for Red Hat, which open source upstream projects we should act as a steward for, and just participating in a project does not make you a steward, as David said earlier. So we need to understand what the priority is and which of those projects we actually should act as a steward for. The second work stream we have on here is vulnerability management and incident response. And those of you that are familiar with the CRA are probably saying to yourself, wait, those are actually obligations that are outlined in the CRA. And you're 100% right, they are. However, there's a lot of additional specifics in regards to vulnerability management and incident response that are required by the CRA. And the effective date for those reporting obligations is 2026, not 2027 when the entire law goes into effect. So we felt it was appropriate for us to have a work stream dedicated to looking at vulnerability management and incident response to ensure that we've got those capabilities in place. We've got the mechanisms to provide SBOMs and other deliverables to customers and external organizations in place. We're providing the right level of guidance upstream as part of the stewardship obligations to open source projects on how they can handle vulnerability management incident response a little more robustly than maybe they're doing it today. Next slide, please. These next 2 work streams are a lot about our external engagement. So the first one is participation in the European Union standards bodies. There are a lot of different organizations in Europe that are talking about horizontal and vertical standards, as well as implementing acts that are defining more specifically some of the pieces of the CRA. We want to make sure that we are engaged with them as much as we can be, either by direct participation or in concert with a foundation such as the OpenSSF, Linux Foundation, or Eclipse, to help them understand what some of the repercussions are, some of those considerations are when it comes to open source software in particular. We want to make sure that open source is not being stifled. That was a concern that just brought up by Adrian in the last couple slides. And by participating in these organizations and working with the foundations to get that message to the right people in the EU as part of these different standards bodies is very important. When we talk about the upstream engagement and contributions, this is also related to stewardship to a certain extent, but this is our work with the open source community. So this is general work that we do with the open source foundations I mentioned earlier, not necessarily specifically geared toward the standards bodies, but providing awareness and information to the open source community. Things like what we're doing today, things like some of the educational materials that have been released, participation in the Eclipse ORC, the OpenSSF Cyber Policy Working Group, and others. We want to make sure that we are sharing our understanding and our expertise with the open source community for the betterment of the entire ecosystem, and hopefully have an outcome that is embracing open source and allowing it to continue in a secure fashion, but still an open fashion and contribute to software in general. Next slide, please. The top one on here, conformity and certification, is much more of a manufacturer obligation than something that would be on a steward's list of concerns. As a manufacturer, Red Hat is going to have to provide statements of conformity and possibly certifications for our products of digital elements, our software. These are divided up into different classes by the law, and there's different activities that are required and deliverables that are required for each of them. So we need to make sure that our internal compliance team understands exactly what needs to be done. They know who to talk to, whether it's an external organization that we need to report to or someone we need to work with to put a certification together. And a lot of this information is not available right now, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But that's the main crux of the outcomes for this work stream. And the last three we've got here on the bottom, comms and awareness, data collection, and legal. There's a variety of actions that they're taking. We need to ensure that we are providing the right level of internal awareness to Red Hat associates and working with external organizations to help raise the awareness of the CRA overall and what its impacts are going to be. Internally, we have to collect data to measure how we're doing with the CRA obligations and ensure that all the different business areas that are affected are getting the proper support. And legal is critical. We need someone to help us understand the legalese. I am not a lawyer, and I'm happy about that, and that's okay. There are very, very smart people who are very good at that job and can help us decipher exactly what the CRA means, as well as these additional materials that are forthcoming. Next slide, please. You've probably heard, and as I've been describing, some of the challenges we've come across. These are things that I think folks need to take into account when they're looking at the CRA and how it's going to affect them. A lot of ambiguity in different parts of the law. Some of it is intentional. There are things it says you need to do, but doesn't give you specifics to put together requirements. So certain assumptions need to be made. Involvement with the standards bodies can help with this to understand the direction that they're going in, what their expectations might be. There are unknowns. There's a great deal of material that's going to be forthcoming over the next 18 months or so across the board that's going to be providing additional information. Understanding what that material is intended to do and how that's going to affect the law and the expectations overall is important. Standards work is happening across many organizations in the EU, even at the nation state level. So keeping track of all these is challenging, let alone trying to participate in them and provide some of your ideas and influence to ensure that they're looking at things in a reasonable fashion to come up with a good outcome like they want, but also the implementation is something that is doable. Dave mentioned this earlier. I'm going to hit on this again in the next slide. There's a lot of tight timelines in here. There are certain due dates, such as the reporting for vulnerabilities and severe incidents in September of 2026. The standards that may influence that are not officially formally due until a couple weeks before that date. So that needs to be something that is concerned. Let's go ahead to the next slide, and I can wrap things up with some takeaways. So hopefully what I've said is helpful in understanding how to approach the CRA, figure out what it means to your business, what roles apply to you. Make sure you're looking at the deadlines and how those deadlines affect you directly. Figure out what tasks are important, prioritize them, start small, work your way up, be prepared to adapt as more information becomes available. And most importantly, here at the bottom, get engaged with foundations and other entities. There's a lot of smart people with a lot of good information to help all of us together figure out what needs to be done and how we can approach this. Next slide. Thank you.
And those of us that get to collab on this a lot are very well aware of CRA Tuesdays, an exciting 6 to 8 hour block of meetings. We get to collaborate on this stuff every week. But now Dr. Wheeler is going to talk about something that you can take to arm yourself and help educate you yourself, your developers, and your organization. David, let's talk about LFEL 1001.
Okay, fantastic. So, the CRA really is a sea change. There are specialized kinds of software, specialized devices where there has been regulation, but most software has not been regulated like this in any way before. Certain other kinds of products, that people use have been, but this is really new in software. So we have a course that specifically gives an outline of what the CR is all about, called Understanding the EU Cyber Resilience Act, LFEL 1001. On the right is the outline of the course. We first give an introduction, talk about roles, talk about product categories, which are important, and then talk about, well, what are the requirements for different roles and categories and situations? Anywhere from open source software, manufacturers, importers, distributors, and so on. And finally, a little about adapting to the CRA and general wrap-ups. How do you deal with this as an organization? Next. One thing that we are very happy about is that, in spite of the fact that this is new, there's a lot of somewhat vague terminology. To the extent that we can, we try to give real world recommendations and suggestions. We're very interested in real world thought, not some theory. So we try to explain how you can implement these requirements. Things like, hey, this thing in the CRA, paragraph 2B says has to be secured by default. What's that mean? Well, instead of just delivering a system with a known username password like admin, where there's a large number of products where everyone knows that they aren't changed, everyone knows what the passwords are going to be if they're hooked up on an internet. Just do things like, when you first start up the system, require that you set a new password. That's not the only way you have to do it, but this is an easy, well-known way to deal with that. Another one talks about reducing the impact of an incident through various mitigation techniques. In fact, we in the OpenSSF have a lot of resources specifically to do things like that. Anywhere from compiler option hardening flags, operating system configurations, CSP, and so on. So we've got some guidance. We point to other guidance. Next. So if you're an open source software contributor, if you're a project lead, how can you use this? It's pretty straightforward. It's an express learning course. It does not take a lot of time. Take the course. If you're a manufacturer under the CRA, of course, the CRA directly applies. If you're a steward under the CRA doesn't have many requirements, but it does have a few. You should know what they are. Now, the key thing is, even if you are not directly required to implement CRA requirements, say you're developing an open source software project, it doesn't meet any of the requirements that make it commercial. The thing is, the CRA is going to impact a lot of your users. And so that indirect effect is going to affect you indirectly. They're going to be asking for information. They're going to ask for hardening. And so I think it behooves all of us who develop software to learn more about the CRA. And please let others know about the course. It's free. You can't beat this price. Next. So here's some available resources. I've talked about the LFEL 1001. We are working on a brief guide for about the CRA for open source software developers coming soon. We actually have a draft. We're planning to do a soft launch at the beginning of July and make a larger splash mid-July. Fundamentally, we're trying to make sure that we get lots of people time to review this document before it gets out. But don't tell anybody, but here's how to get the draft version. Next. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, expert panel, and thank you to this really engaged audience. I'm going to start. We have a couple questions pending in our Q&A, and then if we have time, I'll circle around to the questions that are in the chat. We have a user, Hank, asking, the SBOM required information is limited. Has any other optional information items that you're aware of been identified that are required by the CRA? And maybe I'll route that to Dave Rousseau first.
Thank you, Krob. So there is not any definite information about the more specific formatting and data points that need to be included in the SBOM. There are conversations among I believe it's the horizontal standards group that include SBOM contents. And again, we expect that those are going to be available at some point, but we do not yet know for sure what those are going to be.
Thank you. Next up, I will ask Dr. Wheeler to maybe take the lead first. We have a question about reporting obligations. Does this mean that someone will need to report known security-related issues that exist within their defect tracking system?
Okay, it turns out this answer is a little more complicated. And I guess the full answer is there's a course you can take that will cost you nothing that will get into this. But let me give a superficial, high level answer and pointing to the full, complete answers in this express course. The thing is, are we talking about vulnerabilities in your own software or vulnerabilities in software you bring in? In other words, vulnerabilities in something else. Are these known to be exploitable, or are these just vulnerabilities, but they've been quietly reported? They're not public yet. And the answers to those questions will determine what you have to report to, what you have to report, and to whom. Unsurprisingly, if it is known to be publicly exploited vulnerability, and it's in software that you wrote, your organization wrote, say, or you personally wrote, there's a completely different set of requirements than, say, someone reports, I think you've got a vulnerability in this component, nobody knows except for us, a completely different circumstance. In the case of known exploitable vulnerabilities, there are very tight timeframes. In fact, I think some organizations' minds are going to blow when they see the timeframes. They're talking about 24 hours. And oh, by the way, that's the maximum. They really want you to be much faster, and you should be. It absolutely must be no more than 24 hours. And I think, frankly, you have to justify if you went that long, which is a very different viewpoint than a lot of organizations are used to. Now, they don't have to report the universe in that kind of time frame. You can't report a lot of information you won't have. But again, go check out the course. It gets into this. It's more complicated than you might like to hear, and the timelines for some of these cases are way more strict than I think most organizations are ready for.
Yeah, and I think the particular vulnerability reporting is Article 14. And again, what David's talking about, that 24-hour timeline, that's notification to a new system called the Single Reporting Platform, that an organization is aware there's active exploitation. And then there's timelines with which you need to produce a workaround or mitigation. And then by the time you must ultimately need to have that situation completely corrected. So please refer to the legislation and to understand the nuances for the different permutations of things.
Yep.
Next up, let's talk about software as a service. Let's say that an organization has a web-hosted SaaS system. Is that considered a PDE under the CRA? And are there web-hosted user applications kind of in this mix? Or is it just specific parts of the system? And it looks like David Wheeler might want to start us off.
Yeah, I'll start us up. The short answer is it depends. The standard lawyer answer, frankly. If you release a product, say a mobile application, okay, that's considered commercial and so on, and as part of that product, it calls back to some service that is designed to support and work for that product, then yes, it would be considered part of the PDE. In other cases, with vast number of cases, a website would not be considered a PDE. So it's unfortunately, this is one of those situations where it's not simple yes or no. The answer depends on if it's frankly part of a particular product, then it is included. If it's just a general service, not connected to any particular product that people say download and install, then it's not. And if anybody wants to extend that answer, that's great.
We have several questions circling around the steward role. So first off, let me ask this question, and maybe Dave Rousseau, you could help kick us off, and then Wheeler can supplement. Uh, do we know yet if the steward is a de facto, kind of auto-assigned designation, or is that something that you opt into? Is that something that somebody could step into proactively? Can you give us a little more insight into what you're aware of around stewardship?
Yes, so it's a very good question. The assumption that we are working on at this point is that stewardship is not something that is assigned. It is something that is opted into. An organization states that they intend to be a steward for an open source project and accept the responsibilities that also come along with it. There's a lot of ambiguity around a lot of the stewardship conversation. I think David would agree with me on that one. And we are waiting to get some more clarity via some of the additional implementing acts and some of the standards that are coming out that will hopefully codify this a little bit better so everyone understands what the expectation is when they're approaching how they're going to handle stewardship.
Okay. I'm going to make a slightly different answer. So controversy. We get the fisticuff stuff, but not really. In most cases in law, and I think it would be yet another example of it. The question is, am I meeting some role is entirely defined by the law. If you meet the legal requirements of some term, then you are that term. Whether or not you wanted to be in that category or not, the law determines whether or not. Now, the challenge, of course, is, well, the law, of course, is just text on a page. Who actually gets to make the decision? And the true answer, I think, is European courts make the call. Now, that said, I think most organizations, if they're wise, should be looking at the CRA law and figuring out, given those definitions, what am I trying to accomplish, and trying to make sure that they stay within the law. So, for example, if you don't want to be a manufacturer, make sure that you are not doing anything that in the law triggers you becoming a manufacturer. Same for stewards. I don't think you need to worry as much. The requirements on stewards are much smaller. And so in a grand sense, you do choose whether or not you're going to be a steward because you choose what you're going to do. But given your actions, that will quickly move you towards, are you likely to be a manufacturer or a steward or something else?
Yeah.
And as I'm sorry, Cope, if I can just one quick thing. As you can tell by the different perspectives from which David and I gave our answers, this is a potentially tricky legal question. So I encourage anyone who is concerned about how stewardship is going to impact them, seek out legal advice, depending on the organization that you're a part of.
Yes. And we are going to totally agree on that one. Yeah. And I believe that question is going to be asked again and again across many organizations all around the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, staying on the stewardship question, we have a audience member asking, what potentially would the penalties be? Has that been discussed for stewards for noncompliance on the three stewardship obligations? Are either of you aware of any activity around penalties for stewards?
I am not immediately or off the top of my head to answer that question. I apologize. That would be something that I would definitely discuss with our legal team. I think it probably depends, and this is conjecture. I think it probably depends on the nature of the entity who is the steward. I think this something's probably going to be figured out by the courts at some point, unless some prevailing implementing act or additional information becomes available beforehand.
Yeah, I don't have a simple answer for that as well. I think that in practice, regardless of how the CRA text is written, I'm getting the impression that since it's indeed various governments who will decide who they go after and so on. The general intent of the CRA is to try to treat the stewards with a light touch. They're really much more interested in ensuring that manufacturers who are making a lot of money off products meet certain requirements. So that may not be the most satisfying answer that you'd want to hear. If you're worrying, if your goal is to primarily worry about the penalties, that's probably not the ideal goal anyway. It would be much better if you just figured out what are you required to go do and then go do that, rather than what are the penalties for not doing what you're supposed to be doing.
So there's an interesting question that may come to fruition sooner than we'd like. We have an audience member, Chris asks, if an open source creator, so the maintainer, the project, a contributor there up there, doesn't accept obligations, they don't want to be a steward, and a for-profit software provider uses that open source component, do they automatically inherit the obligations of steward and manufacturer for that component?
I think part of that is easy to answer.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Let me start with the easy one, and then I'll hand off to Dave the hard part. Yeah, if someone brings in some software and uses that software component as part of a commercial product, then they are considered a manufacturer, full stop. Okay, that's just what the CRA says. If they are performing certain actions that make them a commercial developer of a product as defined under the CRA, they are a manufacturer. Now, there's no requirement that the software have a steward. Okay, that's not steward is a new role, and one of the interesting things is that under the general European product liability rules, this is a completely new role that hasn't been seen anywhere else. So, in some sense, I mean, the CRA does define it, but we're still in many ways trying to feel out exactly where the boundary is, and that's going to be a challenge for many. So just because you're bringing it in from somewhere else, that doesn't mean that the other organization is a steward. It just means that they might be a steward, and then you have to look at the law to determine whether or not they are. So Dave, I'm going to leave you all the hard parts.
Thanks. Thanks for cherry picking the easy answer out of there, David. That's good. No, David's 100% correct. Just because you pull a piece of open source software into a product with digital elements that you are marketing, does not automatically make you a steward for that project. Okay. In fact, there is a line under the definitions in the CRA that says the same entity cannot be a manufacturer and a steward at the same time. The implication is at the same time for the same software, but it doesn't say that. So I think the long and short is really what David said. Once a piece of open source is pulled into a product with digital elements and is being marketed, the entity doing that becomes a manufacturer, and that's very, very clear. And there doesn't seem any question about that from anyone that I've talked to. Not all projects need to have stewards. And just because a piece of open source software is used doesn't mean it has to have a steward, and doesn't necessarily obligate any particular entity to be a steward. But please go back to what Dave's response was a little bit earlier. It's what you're doing based on what the law says you're doing that classifies you is important here. So there's nuance that needs to be taken into account. Yeah. And I hope that answers that question, because it's a very tricky subject.
Thinking about the steward role, this was created because of overwhelming feedback they received from the upstream open source community, and to help recognize entities like the Linux Foundation or Apache and Eclipse, software foundations and nonprofits or consortiums that are helping support these software projects. So like the LF houses projects like Kubernetes and the kernel, but we don't make a profit off of that. We provide infrastructure and support for those amazing maintainers. And that's where the steward role allows organizations like us and our peers in the ecosystem to be helpful and to provide that means of helping coordinate between the manufacturers and some of these regulated folks, helping make that connection between the software and the creators.
If I may jump in here quick, because we've been dancing around a little bit. The CRA is an example of a larger set of laws involving regulation of products in Europe, in the EU. And if you're curious, it is very, very helpful to look at a document called the Blue Guide. And And the blue guide helps give context if you're trying to understand how this fits in the broader world. Interestingly enough, surprisingly, product regulation is something the EU has done in many, many cases. And in other circumstances, they occasionally have created specialized roles for specialized circumstances. So creating this stewardship role, while the role itself is newly defined in law, the idea of occasionally defining a new role for a particular kind of product isn't new. For example, they have other regulations involving elevators, and there's a special role called a lift installer, and that's specific to lifts. So, so this broad idea of identifying a special role for a special kind of product isn't new, but because stewards have never been defined in law before, we're going to see a lot of questions about it. And there's going to be a lot of uncertainty as we go along. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of the situation right now.
And I'll have time for one more question. We turn it over to my friend Angela to bring us home. And I think it's going to be I know what the answer is going to be, but we have a question here is, could we potentially share sample documents that help demonstrate an organization's compliance? So thinking about the risk assessment and SBOM materials you might turn over to the Market Surveillance Authority. So do we have any canonical examples today of those types of artifacts?
So I would say that there's probably several different examples out there that people can look at, but this is an excellent opportunity to get engaged with organizations like the OpenSSF, the Cyber Policy Working Group, and the Best Practice Education SIG are putting these materials like these together to help spread awareness and educate the community on what the CRA is looking for as far as some of these deliverables are concerned and what they actually mean in the grand scheme of the laws. So I don't have any links to share immediately, but we have been having conversations about these in the working groups now for some time. What are the value examples, templates that we can provide as deliverables to help people understand exactly what the expectations are going to be? So
And I'll also note that some things like the risk assessment that manufacturers are required to do are currently being talked about in, I can't recall if it's ETSI or Sensanilac. There are broadly two standards bodies that are involved in this process, and they've kind of divided up the different types of standards to help demonstrate compliance. And things like risk assessments and SBOMs are currently being discussed right now or will be very soon. So that's something that, both David and Dave mentioned. There's a lot of forthcoming things over the next 18 months. So please keep an eye out for that, and engaging in groups like our Global Cyber Policy Working Group or the Eclipse Org Working Group. That'll help make sure that you have the most up-to-date and complete information as it's released to the general public. And with that, I have a couple more questions we're not going to be able to get to today, but I will work on seeing if we can get these incorporated into our working group and our just general facts so that people can refer to those going forward. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists, Adrian, the Daves, excellent work. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And I would like to ask my friend Angela to kind of wrap us up.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick call to actions and resources to share here. So everything that we mentioned today will be available on the slides, and also here are the links for you to click on and to scan the QR code as well. Please check out the EU Cyber Resiliency Act 2026 obligations slide deck, and also the official publication of the Cyber Resilient Act that's published by the European Commission. And also feel free to join our Slack channel for Global Cyber Policy Working Group, or GitHub page, and also the mailing list. And just a quick update on the events that we're having this year. So Community Day North America is happening this month, and we're actually having David to join us at the LF Education Learning Lounge, where he will be talking about CRA. And if you're going to be there, catch him in person, ask him a bunch of questions, and he's going to be there on the 24th from 4 to 4:45 p.m. local time. And we also have the Community Day Japan happening on the 18th, Community Day India in August, Europe in August as well. Sponsorship opportunities are still available, and we also have the Community Day Korea in November, and CFP closes in August. And I'll give it back to Rob.
Yeah. And just to note, as Angela showed you that list of events, our Global Cyber Policy Working Group and others will be either presenting knowledge or kind of sharing things at each of those events. And also we'll be having in-person meetups. So if you'd like to talk with other experts or other manufacturers or stewards, think about attending one of those events. But more broadly, the OpenSSF is a fully public and open to everybody to come participate. If you are interested in talking about the CRA, or you want to talk about supply chain security, artificial intelligence development security, consider joining a working group or tracking one of our projects. All of our work is broadly published publicly, whether that's in Slack, on a mailing list, or in a Git repo. And all of our meetings have a public calendar entry that you're welcome and invited to come participate in. And we also use the traditional mailing lists. You can get a hold of us on all of the socials. LinkedIn and Mastodon and YouTube are probably our predominant outlets, but we also go on other social media outlets and consider signing up for a mailing list. And also, if you really like this work, you want to see more things like this, consider you or your organization joining the OpenSSF or the Linux Foundation as an official member and help contribute to and steer some of these things. And again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our over 50 attendees and anyone that watches this virtually on YouTube later. So thank you all. I appreciate you sharing your expertise and enjoy the rest of your day.